Today is the World Day Against the Death Penalty, and to celebrate this day for the 15th time, ICJ, or the International Commission of Jurists, is having a forum with the prisoners at the Committee prison to deliberate and on how to completely absolve this, especially here in the country. And to shed more light on this particular story, we're now joined by the Programs Officer of ICJ, Silas Kamanza, who's joining us live from the Committee prison. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you very much for making time for KTN News Desk. I think I would just want to start with the theme of this year's celebration of the world, of marking the World Day Against Death Penalty. It is poverty and justice, a deadly mix. Just shed more light on that theme.
Yes. So I think the fact is in Kenya right now, justice has been very expensive, and for the common mwananchi down there in the society, they are not able to afford legal fees. They are not able to afford proper representation in court. They do not understand the complexity of the legal processes and the court process in general. And so you find that most people who have been prosecuted and sentenced and who are on death row are those who are poor in our society. And so therefore there's an inextricable link, a very clear link between poverty, justice, and the death penalty.
From the conversations you've had with the inmates since morning, since this particular forum began, what are they saying?
The inmates here, we've had quite an elaborate talk with them, and what we have found out is that as jurists, one, we have a very important role to ensure that legal aid and access to justice is ensured in the country, particularly that the justice system needs reforms, especially the criminal justice system in Kenya. We have seen from the judiciary's decisions that have been passed in the case of Godfrey Mutiso versus R, and in another case of Joseph Njuguna versus R, that the court jurisprudence in Kenya differs, and therefore we need as jurists and as Kenyans to agree and say that the death penalty is inhumane and degrading when looked in the light of the new constitution and Article 26, and therefore it should be abolished. Specifically and particularly, the mandatory provisions for death penalty should be completely removed from our legislation.
From what you said earlier, you mentioned that people living in abject poverty are at a greater risk of being sentenced or getting the capital punishment in the country. And you talk about them not affording legal fees, etc. But does this mean that the law is a bit unfair to those who are poor in the country?
The fact is, according to the law, is that everybody, including those common mwananchis and those in the death row, should be equal before the law, and therefore protection of their human rights should be guaranteed just like anyone else. The Constitution under Article 26 provides for the right to life, and particularly it provides and mandates the state to protect everyone for this particular right. And not only the Constitution, but international and regional instruments that Kenya as a country has accepted and signed into, particularly the ICCPR, the International Convention of Civic and Political Rights, which Kenya is a member. And particularly, we see that Kenya has not signed the second optional protocol, which aims at the death penalty. So, in essence, the law is the law, and it should be applied equally to all. The law is not, does not choose to apply differently to one person and the other, but particularly it is the interpretation that we need, and therefore there is a case in court right now that we are trying to see that the courts come up with a particular precedence that can be followed to ensure that the death penalty is not issued by the judiciary.
Let's talk about the campaigns that ICJ and other human rights bodies have been having towards this. What are you championing for?
ICJ, together with partners, both non-governmental partners and development partners and also government partners, have been working together to ensure that the death penalty, the mandatory provisions for the death penalty are removed. Particularly, we have done advocacy, teaching the citizen down the ground about the need to abolish this practice. Just the other year, we saw the Power of Mercy Committee, in collaboration with the National Crime Research Center, doing a research that shows that Kenyans want the death penalty to be still in practice. But in essence, when you look at this, we need to teach people why the death penalty is basically the right to life is a fundamental right to every person, and that the death penalty is very important as Kenyans to decide that it is removed. We have been teaching the community down the community. We have also had talks at the African Commission. We have taken this conversation at a higher policy and legislative level. We have discussed with our fellow colleagues at the 58th and the 59th African Commission sessions in Banjul, where a resolution was passed in the 59th session that all countries, especially those that have a moratorium on the death penalty, make considerable steps towards total abolishment of the practice.
For the sake of our viewers, let's just quickly take a look at some of the facts we have on capital punishment in the country. Kamanzi, I'm coming back to you in just a minute. So capital punishment has been practiced in Kenya since independence. Since before independence, it was actually introduced in the country by the colonialists and is still provided for under the law. So it means since when the colonialists came in, we've been practicing this. It has yet to be repealed on the law. No executions have been carried out in Kenya since 1987. The last people to be executed in the country were Hezekiah Ochuka and Pancras Oteo Kumu, who were hanged for treason in 1987. Well, in 2009, just recently, Kenya commuted all death sentences of life imprisonment, and this impacted over 4,000 death row inmates. And the move was made to compel prisoners to work. Remember, those who have been condemned to death are exempted from working. So this move was to see death row inmates also get their chunk of work inside the correctional facilities like every other prisoner. Well, despite the lack of executions, the death sentences are still passed in Kenya. Like in 2013, in July, Ali Babitu Kololo was sentenced to death for his role in the murder and kidnapping of 2 British tourists. So it means some are still being served with death sentences in the country. And in 2014, there was a nurse who received a death sentence after being convicted of carrying out an abortion on a woman who subsequently died from that particular procedure. These are just some of the recent cases where a number of people have been served with death sentences in the country, coming in as soon as 2014 and 2013. 2014 for the nurse who carried out an abortion that led to death, and 2013 for Ali Babitu Kololo, the father of 2, who was said to have helped in the murder and kidnapping of 2 British tourists. So back to Silas Kamanza, who's a programs officer of ICJ, looking at these latest cases where people were served with death sentences. What is ICJ doing to ensure that in the coming years we don't see this happening?
ICJ Kenya, together with its partners, have done a lot to fight for the abolishment of the death penalty. First of all, we at ICJ Kenya, we did a research which is quite abstract from what we are talking today, but very related. The research was on decriminalization and reclassification of petty offenses, where we saw that most people down the community brush their shoulders much more with the county laws. And there we saw that some of these laws can be traced back to the colonial regime, as you have spoken to us, Akisa. And particularly when you look at the death penalty, immediately after 1963, we can find reports that that show us that the death penalty was heightened during the Mau Mau season, where the colonial regime used violence and killing to punish the rebels that were there at that particular time. And so ICJ has been very clear about its intentions. But particularly, one of our staff and members of our commission sit in the National Council Administration of Justice Committee on Criminal Justice Reforms, which is mandated to review the penal laws and mandated to review the punishment, the penal code, the legislation that provides for punishment for crime. And therefore, we intend to use this particular platform to advocate for change in society. Further to this, we have done a lot. As I said before, we have worked with our several partners and engaged in deliberations at the African Commission level, where Kenya as a state is required to give in reports every periodic time to ensure that they actually adhere to the agreements that they have put in place with other African parties. In particular, the ICCPR, which is the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which mandates for the state to protect the lives of its citizens. Now, when you look at the political willingness for our leaders to ensure that this is adhered to, we see that the second optional protocol to the ICCPR has not been signed, and this particular protocol fights for and advocates for total abolishment of this particular practice. Now, on the other hand, you see that Kenya has tried to make steps by making a moratorium and saying that all convicts who are in death penalty, who are in the death row, will not be executed. Well, after our deliberations in the African Commission, a resolution was passed, and we decided, we agreed that all the countries that have a moratorium should make considerable steps and should go towards total abolishment of the practice.
Silas Kamanza, thank you very much for joining us here on KTN News Desk. He is the Programs Officer at ICJ, the International Commission on Juries, as they continue to champion for the review of the law on death sentences or death penalty or capital punishment, if you like. Once again, Silas, thank you very much for joining us.